Shadows of occupation. Greece in ruins after World War II, the story begins in silence. An unnatural silence across the mountains and villages of Greece. The Second World War had ended, but for the people of Greece, peace never truly arrived. Instead, the land was left broken, starved, and waiting for the next storm. During the brutal years of Axis occupation, 1941 to 1944, Greece had been ravaged more than most. The Nazi regime and their allies squeezed the country dry, seizing food, destroying infrastructure, and enforcing terror. Entire villages were burned as punishment for resistance. In Kalavrita, in December 1943, the German army massacred over 500 men and boys, leaving behind only ashes and weeping survivors. Starvation also became a weapon. In Athens, the Great Famine of 1941 to 42 killed an estimated 300,000 people. Families buried loved ones in shallow graves. Children wandered the streets, skeletal and silent. But amidst the horror, resistance took root. The mountains of Greece became the home of fighters who refused to bow to foreign rule. Among them rose the ELAS, Greek People's Liberation Army, the military wing of the leftist resistance movement EM. These partisans fought the Germans with guerrilla tactics, ambushing convoys, sabotaging railways, and rallying villagers with a vision of a free Greece built on equality and social justice. Yet even as they fought the occupier, divisions began to harden inside Greece itself. On one side were the communists, strengthened by their role in resistance and their appeal to the poor. On the other stood royalists, conservatives, and traditional elites, many of whom rallied around the exiled King George II and Britain's promise of eventual liberation. The seeds of civil war were being planted even before the Axis forces withdrew. When Germany finally retreated in late 1944, Greece should have celebrated its liberation. Instead, the question of who would rule Greece erupted violently. In Athens, rival militias clashed in the streets. British troops, who had landed to help restore order, found themselves facing the very partisans who had resisted the Nazis. Winston Churchill himself flew to Athens in December 1944, desperate to prevent Greece from falling under communist control. His order was clear: do not hesitate to act as if you were in a conquered city. The confrontation became known as the Decembriana, the December events. For weeks, the Greek capital turned into a battlefield. Ellis fighters faced British troops and Greek government forces loyal to the monarchy. Barricades were raised, artillery shook the city, and civilians were trapped in their homes as bullets whistled through the air. In the end, the communists retreated, but the bitterness remained. Greece was no longer just recovering from Nazi occupation. It was now split down the middle, a nation torn apart by ideology. By early 1945, the Varkiza Agreement attempted to calm the storm. The communists laid down their arms in exchange for promises of political freedom and amnesty. But almost immediately, the deal collapsed. Across the countryside, former resistance fighters were hunted, arrested, or even lynched by right-wing militias. Villages that had once flown the red flag of ELAS now lived in fear of reprisals. Thousands of leftists fled into the mountains once again. The wounds of occupation had not healed, they had deepened. The country was also economically devastated. Roads were broken, railways destroyed, cities in ruins. The drachma currency had collapsed, leading to one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern European history. Families carried bags of near-worthless notes just to buy bread. Hunger still stalked the land, even in peace. Amid this despair, the ideological battle lines hardened further. To many on the left, the monarchy and its allies represented a betrayal of the resistance struggle, a return to old feudal hierarchies, and the domination of foreign powers. To conservatives, communism represented chaos, revolution, and the destruction of traditional Greece. And above it all loomed the growing influence of outside powers. Because Greece was no longer just Greece, it had become a test case. A fragile nation where the future of Europe, perhaps even the world, might be decided. The Soviets looked on carefully, though bound by agreements with Britain to stay out. Britain, exhausted but determined, poured men and resources into supporting the royalist government. And soon, a new player, the United States, would arrive, determined to stop the red tide from spreading any further. But before foreign intervention reshaped the conflict, Greece itself had to ignite. By 1946, sporadic clashes between right-wing militias and communist partisans erupted into full-scale war. The countryside burned once again. The Second World War had only just ended, but for Greece, the Greek Civil War was about to begin, a war every bit as brutal, but this time fought not against foreign invaders, but between brothers. And what happened next would drag Greece into the very first clash of the Cold War. Brothers at war, monarchists versus communists in a divided nation. The spring of 1946 was supposed to bring new beginnings to Greece. Instead, it marked the moment the nation's fragile peace collapsed. On March 31st, 1946, elections were held to decide the country's future. But they were boycotted by the communists, who argued that government repression made free participation impossible. The result was overwhelming victory for the royalist and conservative parties, paving the way for the return of King George II. To many, especially in the rural mountains where royalist fighters had once been heroes, this felt like a bitter betrayal. That very night, as the election results came in, gunfire echoed in the northern town of Litakoro. A band of armed communist partisans attacked the local gendarmerie station, killing a dozen policemen. It was not the largest clash Greece had seen, but it was symbolic. This was not just protest. It was the first shot of a new war, the Greek Civil War. To Greece's, the battle lines were clear, yet heartbreaking. On one side stood the government army, loyal to the monarchy, backed by conservative elites, landowners, the Orthodox Church, and increasingly by Britain. On the other stood the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, formed largely from former royalist fighters, communists, and peasants who dreamed of land reform and a socialist Greece. It was, in many ways, a war of brothers. Families split apart. In countless villages, one son joined the army, while another disappeared into the mountains to fight for the DSE. Husbands and wives found themselves on opposing sides. Neighbors who had resisted the Nazis together now pointed rifles at each other. The Greek mountains, with their rugged terrain and thick forests, became the stage for this bloody conflict. Guerrilla fighters of the DSE knew the land intimately. They moved silently through the night, striking at isolated army posts, ambushing patrols, then vanishing back into the hills. Villagers provided food, shelter, and intelligence, but always under fear. For if the DSE came at night, the government army came by day, demanding loyalty and punishing those suspected of helping the rebels. The terror of daily life for ordinary Greeks, the war was unbearable. To be neutral was nearly impossible. If you lived in a mountain village and gave bread to a partisan, the army might return the next morning, accusing you of treason. If you cooperated with the government, the partisans could arrive after sunset, branding you a collaborator. Thousands of families were displaced, fleeing to the cities to escape the cycle of fear and reprisal. Women carried much of the burden. Many were widowed or forced to care for children alone. Others were swept into the conflict themselves, joining the DSE as nurses, messengers, or even fighters. For the communists, women's participation became a proud symbol of equality. But it also meant women shared the dangers: hunger in the mountains, constant bombardment, and capture by government forces. The brutality shocked even those hardened by World War II. Villages were burned to deny shelter to guerrillas. Prison camps swelled with thousands accused of communist sympathies. Torture and executions became tools of both sides. This was not just a battle for territory. It was a struggle for the soul of Greece. The communist dream, what did the DSE fight for? At its core, the movement dreamed of a people's democracy inspired by the revolutions sweeping Eastern Europe. Land reform promised peasants ownership of the soil they worked. Education and literacy campaigns promised to uplift the poor. Propaganda painted the monarchy as corrupt, beholden to foreign powers. Yet this dream faced two major problems. First, many Greeks still remembered the December 1944 battles in Athens, where communist fighters had turned their guns on fellow Greeks. That memory haunted the left. Second, the DSE's survival increasingly depended on support from neighboring communist states, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria. This fed the government's argument that the rebels were not patriots but puppets of foreign powers. The royalist response to the government army, though initially disorganized, had one major advantage: foreign support. Britain provided weapons, supplies, and advisors. British officers trained Greek troops in counterinsurgency, while the royalist propaganda machine branded the rebels as traitors threatening Greece's very existence. But despite British help, the war was far from won. Guerrilla tactics gave the DSE the upper hand in the mountains. By 1947, they controlled significant stretches of northern Greece. Rebel radio stations broadcast defiance, promising that the people's struggle would sweep the monarchy away. The government army grew frustrated, responding with harsher measures. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were forcibly evacuated. Entire populations were moved into protected zones, cutting the guerrillas off from their support base. It was a cruel strategy, tearing families from their homes, but it slowly began to undermine the DSE's lifeline. A war without end? By the late 1940s, Greece looked less like a unified country and more like a patchwork of war zones. The cities were firmly in government hands. The countryside, especially in the rugged north, was often under partisan control. And in between lay burned-out villages, mine-strewn roads, and hungry refugees. It seemed endless. One side claimed legitimacy as the lawful government of Greece. The other claimed to represent the true will of the people. And while Greek men and women bled in their homeland, powerful eyes abroad watched closely, because to them, this was no longer just a Greek tragedy. It was the first front in a much larger struggle. But what happened next would pull Greece into the center of global politics and bring the United States directly into the war. Foreign hands, Britain, America, and the Soviet role in the Greek Civil War was never just about Greece. From the moment bullets began to fly, the world's great powers turned their gaze toward this small, war-torn nation on the edge of Europe. For them, Greece became a test case, a battlefield not only of armies, but of ideologies. Britain struggled to hold on at first. It was Britain that carried the burden of supporting the royalist government. Winston Churchill had long believed that Greece must remain in the Western sphere, even if it meant clashing with the communists. Back in October 1944, Churchill famously struck the percentages agreement with Stalin in Moscow, scribbling on a scrap of paper that Greece would be 90 British influence and only 10 Soviet. Stalin agreed, and he largely kept his word. But promises on paper did not stop war on the ground. British soldiers and advisors found themselves bogged down in Greece, a country ravaged by hunger and political chaos. By 1946, Britain was exhausted. Its empire was shrinking, its economy near collapse. Supporting Greece drained money and men London could no longer afford. In February 1947, Britain delivered a shocking message to Washington. We cannot carry this burden any longer. The defense of Greece, and by extension, the defense of the Mediterranean, would have to pass to the United States. Enter America. The Truman Doctrine for the United States, this was a turning point. President Harry S. Truman and his advisors feared that if Greece fell to communism, neighboring Turkey would follow, and soon the entire Eastern Mediterranean might slip from Western control. The dominoes could begin to fall. On March 12, 1947, Truman stood before Congress and announced what would become one of the defining policies of the Cold War, the Truman Doctrine. He declared that the United States must support free peoples resisting armed minorities or outside pressures. Though he did not name the Soviet Union directly, the meaning was unmistakable. The United States would now commit itself to containing communism, wherever it threatened to spread. Greece was the first test. Washington poured $400 million into Greece and Turkey, funding weapons, supplies, and economic aid. American advisors flooded into Athens, reorganizing the Greek army, training officers, and introducing new tactics against the guerrillas. American planes roared overhead, dropping supplies and, later, bombs on rebel positions. For the first time, the Civil War was no longer just Greek versus Greek. It was backed by the full weight of American power. The Soviet shadow, yet the Soviet Union's role, was far more complicated. Joseph Stalin, bound by his wartime deal with Churchill, refrained from direct intervention in Greece. Unlike in Eastern Europe, where Red Army troops had secured communist governments, the Soviets avoided direct involvement here. Instead, support for the DSE came mainly from Greece's Balkan neighbors, Yugoslavia under Tito, Albania under Hadja, and Bulgaria. These countries opened their borders to Greek partisans, providing safe havens, weapons, and medical aid. Rebel fighters slipped across the frontiers to regroup, then returned to strike inside Greece. Without this lifeline, the DSE could not have sustained its campaign. But even this support carried risks. The DSE became dependent on decisions made in Belgrade or Tirana. When Yugoslavia's Tito broke with Stalin in 1948 during the famous Tito-Stalin split, the rebels lost their most important backer. Supplies dried up. Safe passage across the Yugoslav border was suddenly closed. It was a devastating blow at the worst possible moment. Propaganda and global stakes, while bullets tore through Greek villages, propaganda shaped global opinion. American newspapers portrayed the conflict as a clear-cut struggle between freedom and communist tyranny. For Washington, Greece became a rallying cry. If we lose here, we may lose everywhere. On the other side, communist media painted the royalist government as corrupt, brutal, and enslaved to foreign masters. To them, the DSE fighters were patriots resisting imperialism. Across the world, leftist sympathizers collected funds and spoke out in solidarity with the Greek communists. But the truth on the ground was far more complex. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides relied heavily on outsiders. And for ordinary Greeks, the war was less about global ideologies and more about surviving the night, keeping their families fed, and hoping they would not be punished by whichever side happened to march through their village. America's hand tightens by 1948. American involvement went beyond money and advisors. U.S. influence shaped Greek military strategy. Aerial reconnaissance guided attacks on rebel strongholds. American-made artillery pounded mountain hideouts. And critically, the Greek National Army adopted new counterinsurgency tactics. Scorched earth campaigns, forced relocations, and the systematic destruction of villages suspected of aiding rebels. The war became increasingly brutal. Yet with American resources and Yugoslavia's withdrawal of support to the rebels, momentum began to shift. The Democratic Army of Greece, once a formidable guerrilla force, found itself cornered, its supplies dwindling, its fighters exhausted. Still, they refused to surrender. The DSE clung to their mountain fortresses in the north, convinced that victory, or at least survival, was still possible. But what happened next would seal their fate, ending the war in fire and blood, and leaving Greece permanently tied to the Western camp. The end of the dream, victory, defeat, and the birth of the Cold War order by 1948. The Greek Civil War had entered its most desperate and decisive phase. After years of guerrilla strikes and brutal reprisals, both sides were exhausted. Villages lay in ruins, cities were swollen with refugees, and the mountains echoed with gunfire that seemed endless. Yet the final outcome was near. For the rebels of the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, the dream of socialist Greece was slipping away. The mountains become a trap the DSE had once thrived in the rugged mountains, using their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver the government army. But by 1948 to 49, those same mountains became cages. With the Yugoslav border now closed after Tito's break with Stalin, the rebels lost their most vital supply line. Albania and Bulgaria offered some support, but not enough to sustain a war. Ammunition dwindled, weapons rusted, and food grew scarce. Meanwhile, the Greek National Army, reorganized and rearmed with American help, gained strength. U.S. advisors pushed for modernization, improved logistics, better training, and most importantly, the use of overwhelming firepower. Air power now dominated the war. American-supplied aircraft bombed rebel positions relentlessly. No longer could the DSE move freely through the hills without being spotted and attacked from above. The government also escalated its Hearts and Minds campaign. Entire villages were emptied and relocated into controlled zones, cutting off guerrillas from civilian support. This counter-bandit strategy was harsh, tearing people from ancestral homes, but proved effective. Without food, shelter, or information from local peasants, the rebels were left increasingly isolated. The final battles, Grammos and Vitsi, the end came in two climactic campaigns. In August 1949, the government launched a massive offensive against the DSE's strongholds in the Grammos and Vitsi mountain ranges near the Albanian border. Tens of thousands of government troops, backed by American artillery and aircraft, encircled the rebels. Bombers rained destruction on the mountains, turning forests into blackened wastelands. For weeks, the DSE held on, fighting with desperate courage. Eyewitnesses spoke of fighters clinging to ridges under relentless shelling, of nurses carrying the wounded through burning forests, of young men and women who refused to surrender. Yet the outcome was inevitable. Outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from supplies, the partisans began to fall. In late August, the government army broke through. Survivors fled across the border into Albania. Thousands were captured, executed, or imprisoned. The once proud DSE was shattered. After 3 years of savage conflict, the Greek Civil War was effectively over. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 150,000 Greeks were killed, soldiers, partisans, and civilians alike. Villages lay abandoned, farmland ruined. Over 700,000 people were displaced, many fleeing to cities, others deported or forced into exile abroad. The wounds cut deep into Greek society. Families remained divided for decades. Brothers who had fought on opposite sides, parents who had lost children to the war, communities that never recovered. For the left, the defeat was devastating. Thousands of communists fled into exile, scattered across Eastern Europe. Others languished in prison camps or faced execution. The dream of a socialist Greece had been crushed. For those who survived, silence often became the only option. Speaking of communist sympathies in post-war Greece could mean imprisonment or worse. For the victors, the price was also heavy. Though the monarchy and government had survived, Greece was now a country bound tightly to foreign powers. Independence had come at the cost of dependency, first on Britain and now on the United States. Greece and the Cold War order, the Greek Civil War, did more than shape Greece's future. It helped shape the entire Cold War. For the United States, the victory was proof that the Truman Doctrine worked. Containment had stopped communism's advance. Greece became a loyal member of the Western Bloc, later joining NATO in 1952. American bases, aid, and political influence became fixtures of Greek life. For the Soviet Union, the war was a lesson in restraint. Stalin had kept his bargain with Churchill, refusing to intervene directly in Greece. Yet the results showed the limits of Soviet power. Communism could not spread everywhere. The Cold War would not be won on every front. For Europe, the Greek Civil War was a warning. It revealed how quickly wartime alliances could shatter, how fragile liberation could be, and how viciously the Cold War could play out, not through direct US-Soviet clashes, but through proxy wars in smaller nations. The legacy of a divided nation, even after the guns fell silent, the war's shadow lingered. For decades, politics in Greece remained bitterly polarized. The right celebrated victory over bandits, while the left mourned defeat and repression. It was not until the 1980s, when exiles were allowed to return, that the wounds of civil war began to heal, at least officially. Yet the memory remains. In villages once burned, in families still divided, in the silence of mountains where young Greeks once fought and died. The Civil War is not forgotten. It was the war after the war, the tragedy after liberation, the moment when Greece became the first battleground of the Cold War. And in that story lies a haunting truth. For Greece, World War II did not end in 1945. It ended in 1949 in the smoke and fire of Grammos and Vitsi, when a nation's future was sealed, not just by its own struggle, but by the hands of the world's new superpowers. The Greek Civil War may have ended in 1949, but its lessons still echo today. It was more than a struggle between brothers. It was the first battlefield of the Cold War, a war that would shape the second half of the 20th century. If you found this documentary powerful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next story from history's darkest and most dramatic moments. And I'd love to hear from you. Do you think Greece could have avoided civil war? Or was the clash of ideologies inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all.